Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's true. Like the archive. No, no. Yeah, okay, wow, like the evidence is based. Okay. Wow. I will definitely look more into it. I will definitely look more into it.
So let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Loop event. I am Orhun and this is Sena. We are both students here in the Master's Program Design and Computation. And we will be moderating today's edition on this beautiful sunny day. And thank you for coming on that beautiful weather also. Loops is our event series here at New Practice, initiated together with the Berlin University Alliance, and now supported by the Projekt Zukunft of the State Berlin.
So today we have two guests. One is joining us online, and one is here, like Peter Polack and Anna Engelhardt, who join us for a conversation on investigatory practices between art and technology and the role of algorithmic and parametric techniques in the reconstruction of crimes and human rights violations. And the loop here we have in front of us will show us the time and will show us when each round has finished. And afterwards, we invite you all to continue the conversation at the bar.
So without further ado, let me introduce you to our first speaker, Anna Engelhardt, who is a video artist and a writer investigating the traces of material violence and the ghost of information. Engelhardt's practice deals with the toxic information environments stemming from structures of occupation and dispossession. Joining us online today, Engelhardt reflects on the role of investigatory art practice in the era of highly mediatized war crimes. And yeah, for those of you who are here that are visiting us for the first time, this is our loops who will be showing us the time of each round. And we will first have 50 minutes of input and some brief questions before we move into the second round of input. Then we will have a discussion round in the end. So you probably can't see the loop, but I will let you know if when the 50 minutes are over, I will be like, that's it.
Thank you, yeah.
Now the loop has started.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. Just a second. I hope you can see my screen. Okay, amazing.
Yes, we do.
So yeah, I'm gonna give more like of an artist talk today, and in a talk today, I aim to reflect on the core method of my practice, which combines open source investigations and parafictional narratives to deal with instances of Russian colonial violence. And having worked against Russian colonial violence before the escalation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago, since 2022, I have been rethinking my practice to address the new context of the full-scale war. As you will see from this presentation, Russian expansion before 2022 was undertaken as a covert operation, every aspect of which has been extensively denied. proving that the Russian soldiers invaded the country was a task in itself. This military strategy has been surpassed by the highly mediatized war crimes in which Russia publicly takes pride. What is the new role of an investigatory art practice in such an environment? What does it mean to reconstruct a crime scene, the perpetrator and the process of which is known? And for that, I actually want to start with a short trailer, maybe. No, actually, let's continue. Before I jump into the kind of gist of the talk, I just want to be on the same page with all of you in regards to the methods that I'm using. And I'm sure Peter can comment a lot about that. But I just wanted to be on the same page with you in regards to the term open source intelligence. And open source intelligence, as you can see on the slide, is essentially an array of methods that allow you to scrape data publicly available online to make assumptions or to gather intelligence that is not available online or that is considered secretive. One of the most well-known examples of open source intelligence is satellite images. Satellite images are publicly available online, yet by looking at them, you can uncover information that might be considered top secret, like for instance, I don't know, like military base locations, etc. So that's about open source intelligence. And the open source investigations, something that I normally work with, are frequently characterized by a detached, sterile perspective in which embodied experience is dismissed unless verified. This is something that you can see here on this slide, where you can see a Russian military base, Khmimim, in Syria. On the left, it's a civilian airport in Syria before Russian takeover, and on the right, it's a Russian military base after the conversion. These satellite images were important because, as always, Russia was denying its presence in Syria at the time where it actually invaded. Together with my long-term collaborator, Mark Tsinkevich, we tried to make sense of the mismatch between such distance perspective, let's say the God view, and the reality of graphic horror it aims to represent. We explored this tension in the film Onset, for which I want to show you the trailer.
It is normal, instinctive to be terrified of demons. But do you know why they're dangerous?
So, just a second, let me come back to the presentation. So one of the environments, for instance, that you could see in the film is the military base that I'm showing you here. And what we tried to make in Onset is to explore this tension, recreating a horror movie's embodied limited perspective to oppose it to the detached sterile perspective that is very common for the gut view of the investigation practice. A viewer protagonist of the film, radically vulnerable to the unknown threat, follows the narrative of the satellite images investigation. To achieve this effect, we crafted what we called infrastructural horror, a genre that amplifies inherent dread hidden within extractivist infrastructures. This genre aims to create discomfort, repulsion, or suspense by exposing the architecture of dispossession and destruction as a foreboding. In the film, a demon roams through an ominous synthetic environment, reconstructed from satellite images of Russian air bases, Khmeimim in Syria, Baranovich in Belarus, and Bilbek in Ukraine. Passing through their deserted corridors, interrogation rooms, and electricity substations, this parasitic force sprawls out from the military structures. Devastation follows in its wake. In Onset, we crafted an unholy alliance of medieval demonology, open source intelligence, and CGI animation to uncover the secret life of these military outposts. Over the course of the film, the true horror of Russian colonialism becomes manifest in the process of possession, the imposition of external control that gradually destroys an organism from within. And I think the stuff that we discuss in the film is directly relevant to what is happening today, because the tension that we felt in between the detached perspective of the investigation practice and this kind of working with affect and investigation, I think is very relevant in general to the environments of mediatized war crimes. And I think similarly to how Russia changed the military tactic, displaying and taking pride in its war crimes, the same stuff that I'm discussing today can be applied to the Israeli war crimes today. I think the things that we see, like the satellite images that we see, are no longer as necessary or taking as much of a vital role in discussing the conflict at stake or the violence at stake. I think we way surpassed the media ecology that was happening in early 2000s when by displaying the fact of torture, you could create you could politicize a mass of people. I think today what we're dealing with is not the scarcity of information, but the boundary that is created by the suspension of disbelief. And suspension of disbelief, I feel, is a very useful notion to work with, because suspension of disbelief implies a willing desire of your audience to suspend their disbelief in the image. They might know consciously that the image is not true, but they still choose to believe the false information. So how do you establish your practice in that environment? And I think the only answer to that is to start working with affect and to start utilize that affect and weaponize the affect in a way that aligns with the investigatory practice, not contradicts the investigatory practice. And this is something that comes together when, with Mark, we were thinking about the intersections between the Russian military strategy and a more older tradition of working with these cases of extreme violence that our culture knows how to deal with, specifically when they discuss demons. Demon is that, in culture, is that exacerbated example of evil that I think really well suits both Russian and Israeli military strategy. And one of the critical insights demonology gave us was that the medieval understanding of possession was embodied and material. Just a second. And we show that in all the cases we discuss, the onset of invasion is eerily similar to that of demonic possession, quiet infiltration that aims to uphold the image of seeming normalcy while corrupting the system. In demonology, a demon always seeks to obfuscate and hide its name since it grants power to an exorcist. In an eerily similar vein, Russian troops always come unannounced, hiding their insignia and destroying any proof of their presence. They spread throughout the country from within, taking control over and destroying its vital infrastructure. They weaponize the structures to aid their advance, replacing civilian functions with military ones, turning the sovereign states against themselves. The invading force reconstructs the destroyed infrastructure only to the bare minimum needed to protect and serve the invasion, without any regard for those living under the occupation. When one extracts Russian occupation from the equation, it becomes apparent how fragile the structures are compared to the life force of resistance, ready to take over at any point. One of the critical insights demonology gave us was that a demon would be located in a particular limb and then exercised through connection to that organ. In the body, demons specifically locate themselves in the spinal column, nervous systems, and deepest nervous centers through which they control the whole being. It led us to the clue that a demon, taking control of the body from within, becomes entangled with the body it possesses. We found that the physical connection between seemingly immaterial demonic force and the body it harvests holds true for the way the Russian army is connected to the countries it aims to destroy. Investigating this connection as the Russian army's core weakness became the film focus. We show this connection between an invasive parasitic force and a host through a cord that connects them. This cord in the film is an electrical wire. As we describe in the film, the Russian military base consumes as much electricity as a steel plant. Terror inflicted by Russia is an energy-intensive state. This means that the source of energy that supplies Russian military is its weakness that can be exploited. Tracing the source of energy is a key goal that guides the viewer through the environments of the film. And what you can see on the slide is the work process behind reconstructing the synthetic environments in the film. And on the left top side, you can see the actual location of the military base, of the electricity substation that we managed to locate in connection to Russian military base. This one specifically was the one in Belarus. Then you can see on the
1 minute left, just as a
fantastic.
reminder.
Okay, cool. And then left bottom corner is the process of reconstructing this substation. Then on the right side bottom, you can see me with an iPad walking and navigating the CGI environment, essentially filming it. And then at the background of the slide, you can see the substation as it appeared in the final film. And then this is the still from the final film where the protagonist is walking through the substation. And essentially what we managed to do is we managed to, by coupling the open source investigation methods and this essentially fiction writing, we managed to arrive to the point where we traced the specific geolocation of the electricity substations that Russia relies on in Ukraine, Syria, and Belarus. You can see their location on this diagram and present them or frame them as a diagram that is essentially called a seal. Demonic seals are magic diagrams that are drawn to grant you protection against the demon. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for the heads up.
Thank you very much for the input. That's actually perfect on time. So before we move on to the next section of inputs, we can have two very, very, very brief questions to directly to Anna's input, if there's any questions.
Why did you choose the medium of a narrative film?
Maybe a bit closer.
So, why did you choose the medium of a narrative film rather than a documentary film for this topic?
Because I find it very productive to work in between fiction and documentary, and that's something that I think is like the core of my practice. I find with the when you appeal to the facts in the form that documentary presents, you essentially limit yourself to engage with the information in that kind of information economy that I highlighted as being in crisis at the moment. And I feel the genres, or let's say conventions, that are deeply embedded in our culture afford a lot of answers as to how navigate those cultural complexities. For instance, what I mean with that is it's very hard for us as humans to kind of comprehend another human being doing harm because they enjoy that necessarily, like for instance, or comprehend a certain level of malice that surpasses our culture or like cultural imagination. So tapping into those devices, like cultural devices, let's say, that help you breach that perception, for a viewer creates a feeling that is not entirely possible if you fully function purely in the documentary basis. I hope it answers the question.
Maybe one last question.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I arrived a bit late, so maybe I missed something, but my question was about why did you choose to do your movie using, if I'm not wrong, like a game engine or something like this? I guess half of the stuff you showed, it was made in CGI anyway. So why you decided to do it in CGI and not actually in live action? What is the decision under it? And I guess like I would say like it would be something connected to also money, but if it's also a decision like aesthetically connected to something and to this idea of affection, I would like to know something about it. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a fantastic medium because it is very honest with the viewer about its artificiality. Like, it doesn't create a false impression. Because I feel when you're like walking that binary between that fiction and documentary, you need to be very cautious with what you present as being fiction and fact. And also because I work also with like archival footage and found footage, for me it's very important to maintain this clear distinction between where it has like the factual narrative and like I try to be like honest with the viewer about like where they can rely on directly or like what they need to take this kind of extra step to interpret. First of all, and then I think second is there's another kind of a bit extra layer of that, if you will, because I'm very fascinated with the proposal of simulations, or like what kind of simulations allow us to do politically, what kind of agency it creates, or like relationship it creates with the viewer, and that's something that I'm currently developing in my like other body of work. But in that film as well, we wanted to make this environment essentially as that kind of like actionable simulation for people who are, let's say, more practically engaged in the information that we're dealing with. Like what type of visual ecology it allows for when you can actually train yourself to navigate those environments. Like if you can share this information with people on the ground, to actually rehearse walking through these environments, for instance, and seeing their weak links. So there was another kind of layer of engaging with CGI, and this kind of relationship is only possible with game engines. You cannot quite allow this interesting layer to unfold in the live action.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to the audience for the questions. I think now we can move on to our second guest. So I'm happy to welcome Peter Polack, who's a researcher and a software developer at Forensic Architecture, which is an interdisciplinary research group in London, whose research and practice. I think it's okay. It's working. Yes, yes. Peter's research and practice addresses the role of political imaginaries, theories, and fictions in confronting police and military information systems. He holds a PhD in information studies from UCLA, and in his input today, he will discuss how the advent of algorithmic and parametric modes of reasoning make the objectivity of crime even more malleable, challenging fundamental assumptions about law and justice.
Time is.
Thank you. You can hear me, you can see as well? No. You can hear, yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks to the students for setting everything up. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for Anna for that introduction already. A lot of Anna's practice is about how the facts are mediated. So I hope as we're talking through this talk, you can think about some of the relations there. I'm going to give a history, a very fast one, and kind of a theory. It's less about a practice, but it's about how we can think about what's happening now in its historical context. So if you've been following the news, you know that there are all these AI systems that are associated with the invasion in Gaza. There's been news about this Lavender AI system, this Gospel AI system, and it's not really clear what these systems are doing. There's some information about it, but it's clearly some kind of black box to us, right? So what's interesting about this is that these kind of systems are not being used just by the Israeli military. They're also being used by the United Nations. There's a widespread interest in these types of AI systems as a way to mediate what's happening on the ground. And I wanted to try to pick that apart and give an idea of what's going on there, even if we can't understand what these systems are concretely doing, thinking about how they emerged in history. So to do that, we have to go back all the way to thinking about some of the terms that these systems are using. So one of the terms that this system uses is called social cohesion. So when I saw that, I knew immediately, okay, I've seen this before. This is something that is not new. It's a long-standing practice these systems are using. And where does it come from? So I'm going to take you all the way back to the beginning of what we can think of as true crime. So I don't know if you know what true crime is, but this is like, you think about these podcasts, these TV series that are representing crime, they kind of sensationalize it, right? This is not a really new thing. This has been existing for a long time. Since we could print on paper, we were mediating crime in different ways, sensationalizing it, right? Treating it through these different graphical representations, different types of textual representations. And what's interesting here too is over time, as these prints started to come out about crime, there were different ways that they started to perceive crime. They started to represent crime according to the psychology of the criminal, right? They started to represent crime according to anatomy and things like this. Is it okay? Yeah. So we know from the beginning that design has always shaped perception of crime. That's like nothing new whatsoever. And then what's important here is that this is kind of shift from being just something that has to do with print media to something that has to do with architecture and the design of environments, okay? So when we think about the history of policing, especially in the United States, this emerged a lot out of practices of slavery, which had to be essentially, as slavery was abolished, these practices had to be reinstitutionalized into the police force as we know it today. So part of this was the lantern laws, which actually legally required Black people to hold a lantern as they went anywhere so they could be more visible to the police. So you have these kind of practices that create a way of making certain people more visible to police and making certain people more inherently criminal, right? So as time went on also, we have basically, the origin of modern policing as we know it in the UK, which comes out of the Statute of Winchester to begin with, which was interested in trying to design environments so that people could see crime more easily. And it was also interested in making it so that people would all be legally required to report on crime wherever they saw it. So, like see something, say something, or like see it, say sorted. We have these expressions in the UK and the US. I don't know what the German one is, but this is like the origin of that type of practice. It's having everybody focused on these visibilities of what is criminal and in a way what is not. So moving very quickly here. We know from these things that policing has always concerned appearances. It's always concerned how things look, being able to differentiate what is criminal and what is not, and constructing that appearance as well, right? So you can see that there's already an affinity between design and policing. And that affinity between design and policing really became a concrete thing through these architectural practices, which emerged both in the United States and in the UK as a part of urban development projects, right? So here you can see that there's a design which is trying to say, if we have this open space and everybody lives around it, then everybody can have their eyes set on what's happening in this open area, and we can reduce crime in that way. So if we go back to thinking about how the police are interested in creating these kind of visibilities, this is a kind of architectural reconfiguration of these principles, right? So this is basically becomes instrumentalized throughout the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, up to now in specific policing practices that are still being used. So, we talk about eyes on the street, this notion of eyes on the street, which comes out of these really humanitarian activist public development projects. They have this relationship to the Statute of Winchester before. They have this relationship to the way that design can make crime visible as a way to deter crime and as a way of what is called crime prevention through environmental design, which is a modern policing practice. So there's these other terms that come up along the way, and eventually we arrive at this official CPTED, CPTED as they call it, crime prevention through environmental design. And then we start to see terms like social cohesion. So when we talk about these AI systems that are being deployed in Gaza and in LA right now, pretty much everywhere, they're still like using the specific terminology that came out of these practices. And that's the history that I want to kind of uncover. Something that these systems do is we saw that how they associated crime with certain kinds of behaviors. We know over time, like we know in the beginning, through the representation of crime, there's an interest in trying to figure out what is the psychology of the criminal, what is the behavior behind the crime. So there's this connection that's made there. In addition to that, there's an association made that behavior is actually environmental, right? So you can design environments to influence behavior, and by designing environments to influence behavior, you're in turn able to influence crime. That's at least the idea. So how this plays out in practice is, for example, in the LAPD, which is something I've researched for a while, working with community organizations in Los Angeles, like the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. How this plays out is basically these systems which are trying to measure what they call social cohesion, and they're trying to map that as it would exist in different neighborhoods. Okay, so they're using many different parameters to calculate this, but what they're trying to identify is basically areas that would be more susceptible to crime, right? Areas that would be more kind of inherently criminal by virtue of some kind of environmental traits, right? Or social traits. And here also there's these measures like collective efficacy. These are measures ostensibly of how communities are able to thrive and like work together as like coherent social groups. But what's interesting about this, the way that they measure this, is part of the way that they measure like high social cohesion, high collective efficacy, like so to speak, a good community is whether, for example, communities are willing to call the police when there's a problem. So communities that call the police are basically like rated as higher like social cohesion, and just general like willingness to interact with the police is also higher social cohesion. As well, as I mentioned, there's this contract that the UN had with this algorithmic boutique called Culture Pulse. You can see in their aesthetics how they resemble like Palantir as well. There's like all these types of new systems and startups that are trying to be created to do the same kind of work. And so even if we can't peer into like the black box of this system, we can understand like the historical genealogy that it comes out of and be able to understand like what's going on. And they do make their papers available online, so you can like look through them and see the assumptions there. But they use social cohesion as well, right? They also use a kind of contagion analysis, which is really common in these systems, where they're trying to see, okay, so if somebody is somebody that we've registered as a criminal, how does that crime spread to other people in the environment, right? Either through their social networks, through their families, right? As is really common in gang databases, or through environments, right? So maybe just by virtue of being in an environment. And we see all those, of course, as tactics that are employed by the IDF when they're targeting people. So I mentioned this formula, which is like criminal, behavioral, environmental, this kind of connection of theories that started to become put together. But the question is like, what exactly are these links between criminal and behavioral and environmental? What actual behavior is something that could be detected as criminal, and what actual environment has signs or indicators of being criminal, right? So for a long time, social theorists, criminologists would try to come up with theories that would identify exactly what these links were, but they weren't really working. Like they tried to implement these in like urban development projects, but it wasn't really working. The data was showing that those like architectural changes weren't really doing anything. So there's kind of been the shift where now the way that this is done, the way that these links are created between these factors is basically through data. So how these connections are created is through parameters, basically. So parameters could be any number of things, as we mentioned, like propensity to call the police, willingness to cooperate with the police, like all these things, whether your family is in a gang, right? So these parameters are the ways that these things of being criminal, of having certain behaviors, and having certain environments are articulated together, right? And this is a way that's used to predict crime based on environmental factors, right? Predict crime based on behavioral factors, predict extremism based on behavioral factors, right? So we start to see the shift away from architecture as such towards a kind of interest in like heat maps, for example, heat maps that can say which environments are supposedly predisposed to crime. We also see community relations that start to get mediated as crime indicators, or like communities are now something that could be something that you could look to and measure to understand whether it has a propensity for crime. So you also see this kind of articulation of a community as something that's like determined by data, as opposed to something that is about people's relations with each other. And as well, you see compliance as something that is a heuristic that can be optimized. So when we talk about, you know, people complying with the police, that being a sign of high social cohesion, that is now something that the police kind of want to optimize. They want to maximize compliance. And in cases where they can't do that, in the other geographic regions where they're not maximizing compliance, of course, they use violence, right? And so this is kind of a diagram I made that shows how these things fit together in one policing system. It's too much to go into now, but you get the idea about how all these different theoretical factors fit together into an algorithmic system, which is supposedly going to be able to predict crime, okay? And what is really, really sketchy about this is that, you know, through filing for public records requests and looking to see what these systems are doing, we've seen kind of this correspondence between this basically author of this book, The Rise of Big Data Policing, and this UCLA professor who has now left UCLA because, you know, we made sure that the system Predpol did not exist anymore, and now he's out. You see this correspondence between them in private emails where this academic is telling him, as a strategic matter, you should try to balance race or other factors as a technical matter. So he's trying to tell this person that authored this predictive policing system that basically, like, you need to show the public that like your systems are not racially biased. You need to figure out what are the other parameters that can basically, you know, allow you to continue to do your work without revealing yourself as like explicitly racist, right? So there's this kind of play with parameters, a kind of parametric design that goes into these systems to try to make them maneuver away from certain kinds of controversies or certain kinds of like public discourse and things like this. So this is a part of a kind of academic policing complex where academia is trying to help police reform to use different types of variables that are less suspect, and also as a kind of reformism of algorithms, okay? So what does this mean in practice? I think I'm actually good on time. Basically, the definition of what is criminal is now able to change like very fast and dynamically. Like irrespective of the laws that we have in place to say what is criminal and what is not, irrespective of that, these computational systems are able to use parameters to articulate who is criminal, which communities are criminal, which environments are criminal much more quickly. So in this environment, textual law is absolutely failing to keep up, okay? So there's kind of like a split in like the theory and like the computational practice responding to this problem. On one side, there's people, mostly kind of like more legal scholars, people working in a legal space that kind of say, well, okay, texts are failing to keep up. Computational systems are out of control. So what we need to do is we need to go back to the text of the law. We need to go back to the code of law and use that code of law to hold these systems accountable, right? So this is a kind of doubling down on liberal principles faced with these kind of runaway computational systems. How can we go back to the law to enforce them? That's when you get things like algorithmic bias, transparency, accountability, these kind of liberal terms. The other direction is not any better. It's basically the idea that, okay, this is happening. Maybe these systems are good. Maybe we need to use them to actually like surveil communities. And maybe it's just a matter of changing the parameters to make them better. So this kind of cybernetic utilitarianism is interested in using these kind of parametric designs for social good, but without any awareness of the power structures that they depend on. And for me, the issue is that both of these sides refuse to acknowledge that parameters and laws work together. They work together. You can't really choose one or the other. In the case of the invasion of Gaza, you have a criminal designation of terrorists. You have a criminal designation of Hamas. At the same time, you have all these parameters that are articulating certain people as being Hamas, as being terrorists. So there's kind of a flexibility on the computational side and maybe a rigidity on the legal side, but these work together. And we really have to be able to account for the fact that this is happening. Like we can't just like go to the law or just like start making like cool computer systems, right? We have to have an interdisciplinary practice that is aware of these kind of interactions. And yeah, if you want to know how to do that, I think that's up to everybody. I think that's something that we're trying to do in the workshops here a little bit. So yeah, that's all I have.
So thanks a lot, Peter. I think it's working now. Yes, for your input. So before I open up the discussion to the audience, if you have very specific questions, like very brief and specific questions for Peter, like we can again take two, maybe.
Hey, do any similar parametricizations and databases exist for white collar crime?
So I know there's the white collar like mapping project, right? Do you know about this one? Okay, so like the anti-eviction mapping project has done something like this. I think that they are specifically using like a kind of parametric design to be able to figure out what those are, if I remember correctly. Yeah, but it, you know that project is kind of like a provocation. So it would be, I mean, it would be interesting to like provoke that and take it even further. I don't know. Oh, actually, there are. I think there are that actually, like in terms of like fraud and like high scale like financial crime, there is that kind of thing also. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can have one more question before we move on. Yes.
First of all, thank you for that fantastic talk. Very interesting. I wonder how the parameters are defined and who defines those parameters, because that's a question behind it. Coming from healthcare, and I know that there is no data set which is flawless, I wonder how the decisions are made, which is the data set to jump into. Do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, so I think it would give us all a heart attack to see like how that's being done, especially in this context and like criminology. Yeah, so of course there's like sociologists, like sociology, like consultants kind of course they're all being informed by these existing criminological theories. But yeah, the work, it's pretty sketchy, and like it just takes one statistician, one sociologist to look at that and be like, you can't really do that. It doesn't work like that. So there's a huge amount of flexibility. But of course, it's because the audience of these people that are making these data systems is like the police and like the military for the most part. So that's like where they're getting their contracts. So they kind of just have to demonstrate that there's like this hot new potential in making a system like this that's like incorporating different factors. Yeah, whether it actually works is a whole other conversation. But for example, in the predictive policing platform that was like disbanded, there was a system that was algorithmically predicting hotspots to police, but also they let police manually choose what the hotspots were. So it's like, it's this kind of thing. But you know, we always have to acknowledge how it is like kind of snake oil. There is a lot of smoke and mirrors, but there are concrete things that these systems are doing, and these like parameters and the way that they're following people is a part of it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Anna, and thank you, Peter, for the input. Now we can have a round of discussion between Anna, all of us, Peter, for the open questions that we have. As a starting point for the discussion, I would like to have a question for both of you. How do you navigate in your practice between abstract technological material, for example, satellite data, GPS, and leaked files often framed as objective, and personalized account and situated stories?
So, I mean, you know, I have the practice that this comes out of is based on my own like research, which is really informed by organizing that's happening in LA. And they're in every report, whenever there's an analysis of like the objective algorithms or what's happening, there is also, a kind of, there's like qualitative interviews, going to people like on the street and saying like, okay, this place is known to be a hotspot, like what's happened here. So there is a way, like those things are really not in tension, right? Like you have the algorithmic system that has its own problems, and then you can then go and talk to the person and get the more qualitative representation of that. And then I think also the same thing is at play at forensic architecture, right? Where, the kind of like magic or like the importance of the method is for the objective and the subjective to be able to like corroborate each other in a way. And yeah, those things are really not in tension. They can be, it can happen that you accidentally flatten them together, but I think that with these kind of interdisciplinary practices, it's possible to keep them both there to have a voice. Yeah.
I think that's actually a fantastic question, because I think there is a very interesting, I think there is a very interesting tension happening there, because I mean, I'm coming, as I mentioned before, from that kind of open source investigation background as well. And I feel when you come from that background, there is that kind of idea that personalized or situated perspectives do not matter unless we're capable of verifying them somehow or bring them to the level of the quote unquote objective knowledge. And that creates a lot of very problematic situations. And it is a very common pattern, let's say, and that's been described endlessly in decolonial theory and postcolonial studies, where there is a certain body of knowledge that is well known in a certain community, let's say indigenous people or black community. Let's say it's a knowledge about oppression. And then it is a strong tendency of, let's say, anthropologists or white scientists to come and extract this knowledge from the community, pass it through the Western systems of knowledge and epistemologies, and present it as finally true, objective, or their own. So I find this kind of very old system at play still very prevalent in the way those investigations are conducted today. Usually the statements that are being corroborated or abstracted and, let's say, claimed to be like lifted to that like objective level are extremely well-known truisms for people who are affected by them. If you think about, let's say, I don't know, investigating, like, and that's kind of what I'm interested in my practice at large, right? Because like, what does it mean to make an investigation about Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014? Like, it's so obvious for people who actually saw that happening, like it was like an open secret for so many years, but yet somehow there needs to be that kind of like system that passes through those stories and creates them, like molds them into that parameters of cross verification. And then on the other hand, also as a filmmaker, I know that objectivity is an aesthetic, right? It's an aesthetic that is artificially constructed. And this is something that you learn very quickly when you learn to be a documentary filmmaker. There are specific ways you create a shot, you create a perspective, you create a narrative that creates that feel of like whatever, cinema verite, like the kind of on the ground perspective that is aimed for that objectivity or like true life. So how do you deal with those questions, knowing that kind of criticism exists there in the documentary filmmaking? How do you apply that criticism when you work with investigations? I'm sorry, I'm kind of answering with the open question because I think like it's not very possible to give that like answer to that, but that's something that like really interests me for a long time.
I think having more open questions are never a problem. Any further comments, questions? Yeah, go for it, sure.
I just wondered, in your experience, or I guess for both of you, but more so for you, right? If there's the assessment of some of these parameters being quote unquote negative, right? Like I would presume there's things like poverty, there's things like this idea of social cohesion or like willingness to call the police. How much of that information is used by state actors particularly, or law enforcement, to actually do some sort of remediation, right? To alleviate poverty, to try to work on social cohesion and identify those pain points? Because it's weird, like it almost seems like actually that data could be operationalized in an entirely different way. And is that the source of the tension, or is the data the source of the tension, biased or not?
Yeah, so okay, so I think already in the language and the rhetoric of the police, and almost in the operations of the police, there is it's branded as if it is trying to find those problems, ameliorate those problems, almost in a way where the language of violence is kind of put aside. So that is an explicit part of the language, especially with like community policing, which is like the latest like iteration of policing. It's you know, we're here for the community, we're like coming out for the community, we're trying to find problems in the community. Okay, like textbook example of this is there's like this thing in LA called community safety partnerships, where you know where this is going, right? So the LAPD basically chooses an area that they want to like try. It's like a crime intense area that they want to like kind of solve crime there, so they want to like improve it. So they solicit like a census to the community, and the community is like, oh yeah, we need like more like benches or something like this, something really basic and like innocuous. And then the LAPD is like, okay, we're gonna install more surveillance cameras, and that's like actually what happens. So there's the level of like the kind of police being disingenuous, but I think I would be kind of critical and sensitive to the way that information systems create certain kinds of political leverage, especially for like state actors that actually have like recourse to violence. Like insofar as they do have recourse to violence, like that's really the way that it's going to be like dispatched. Like, of course, the police are not the people that should be responsible for, you know, improving like architecture or like parks or things like this, because what are their solutions? Like install more cameras, for example. So yeah, I think it's an important question to think like, okay, well, could that data be used to do those things? But I think also, you know, it creates a certain type of like optic, which is like emphasizing a certain kind of heuristic of community improvement. And then really how you go about doing that can go in so many different ways. So I think this maybe gets a little bit back to, you know, Anna's critique, which is like, if you just kind of try to apprehend what the problem is, like from a very high level, then you're really just like kind of affirming what everybody already knows. And those kind of power dynamics are still like at play beneath the surface. So I think, yeah, that's a long answer. Yeah, hope that answers, yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk, Peter. Really interesting. I had a few, maybe just remarks, really. And it's just like, when I hear the words police, I always have an immune response that is like, that doesn't work. The police doesn't work, and the law in its broadest category maybe is also a failure, because I think one of the great things that what your presentation showed is, of course, that also what we know as legal systems, whether they're in Africa or whether in Europe, probably coalesce from, you know, these racist ideas of that criminalize, for instance, racial bodies. And so it's so intrinsically buried within those things that to begin to just unearth it, I think is such a monumentous task. But then the thing that I want to ask, or I want to tease out, is whether there is space for law and police outside of police. And I think this is kind of what you touched on with not so much police cooperation as in like neighborhood watch or whatever, because neighborhood watch, especially in Namibia, where I come from, tend to reinforce what the police did during the apartheid times. So I start to think about, if the laws that we know today coalesce from racial and these sort of like notions of what crime is and morality, European morality mostly. Could we draw a form of policing or new directions for justice and law from movements or sort of movements or ideas that fought back against this racializing of police, but still maintained a modicum of justice? Things like what Sylvia, things like designing for fugitivity, you know, and fugitivity coming out of the notion of marine communities, of course, fleeing plantations and living outside of the law, but still living within the community values of what laws are. So my question is that I often think about designing those kinds of provocations as like tactical anti-police technologies, like thinking about a community-sourced database of racist police that can run on like some sort of edge computing in, you know, some kind of like homemade Google Glass. And but then I run into these questions of course, that's interesting, but is it ethical? Because if I trained like I imagine if I trained a data model to recognize racist police, I think it would kind of recognize most white people as maybe racist police, just because such a thing is so hard to approximate in computational dimensions. You get what I'm saying? So I think I'm kind of like just reacting of like the ethics of designing like counter, like tactical technologies, but also as a provocation to draw from other inspirations of what, because we can't, this notion of like this moralist notion of justice and law that we have right now cannot be universal. So just kind of like my thinking around that, yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for saying. I think you really hit the nail on the head. I can't remember the term that you used, but saying like technologies that can be like what was it again? Yeah, basically, like I think if we try to talk in a more abstract way, where we when we talk about policing and we talk about surveillance, and we want to just think about maybe the forms that those take, try to like take it out of like its specific historical like racist genealogy for a second. I think we could try to extrapolate what are the kind of like technological tendencies of those systems. For example, like what is the tendency of having like a paid force that all has like guns? Like what is that going to do basically? Like another thing is that, yeah, what is it going to do if you have surveillance cameras like everywhere, even for like a social good? Like what's going to happen? Probably by nature of those technologies, by nature of the way that they're distributed and designed, there's going to be certain types of tendencies that cause like bad things to happen. I think being attentive to those tendencies is the most important thing. And I think you said that when you said like, what are the types of technologies that could be designed against that? I think, of course, there's like a place for computation for that. But it's really tricky because, yeah, I think as soon as you get into the territory of working with like large scale, for like population scale analytics, things, just the kind of power asymmetries that you're setting up. And maybe that's what the question, maybe that's the answer for police too. Like the power asymmetries that are there are so vast that like, what can you do about it? But yeah, this is a longstanding question at the coalition too. Like, okay, like we're starting to put together, actually check out this project from the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition where they put like every single LAPD officer on the internet with their like, their salary, like how much they're getting paid. It's like a really good tool, but you know, also we have to be mindful of like when we're doing that same kind of surveillance. Yeah. Long answer again. Yeah.
Also, Anna, if you have any remarks or comments or further questions, just anytime jump in.
Yeah, I actually have some. I think I just wanted to introduce some more examples because I think, I don't know if you're aware, but there was like anti-apartheid hacking collective. And I think that was very cool. And there's like a text on eFlux about it. So if you just Google imagine anti-apartheid hacking eFlux, it's going to come up. And then I also wanted, in regards to that question of making a database of police faces and like police facial recognition, and the question of ethics, I think there's like a funny example also that I can propose here. With Mark, we wrote a text about like facial recognition systems and like policing in Belarus. And what protesters did there was very funny, in a way that they claimed that they developed a neural network that can identify faces of Belarus police despite they're heavily masked. And then they provided several pictures of instances where we believe they identify, I mean, Mark and I believe that protesters identified those policemen not by their facial features, but through other open source intelligence means. But they use those cases to pretend that they developed this software that has almost godlike capabilities of knowing who you truly are behind your mask. So then it created a wave of fear in police when they went to beat and kill the protesters, that actually they're not as anonymous anymore as they would like to be. So that was like a very interesting power dynamic subversion there, because like the neural network was very obviously not working. Like if you know anything about how to code these things, you understand that to train an algorithm in that way, it was like they were like identifying them by like not even eyebrows, like it was like purely eyes, and as you know, like from protests, it's like a couple of pixels, etc., etc. But yeah, I think it's like an interesting question it poses about like how to use those technologies and whether they need to actually be functional in the end of the day.
Yeah, interesting. There's one question here.
Hi, my question is a bit more directed towards Peter, but I think it goes in the same vein of what has been discussed so far, especially what was said about the tactical defense mechanisms by the public. Because you presented in your presentation, you mentioned these two views about the topic. One was the going back to the text one, basically, and the other one in believing in those, in such systems. And as you mentioned, both of those are rather, I would say, naive, and but then again, they share this common optimism between the two of them, which is, in one case, they believe the government to be able to regulate and stop those technologies that might be harmful to the public, basically. And then on the other hand, you believe not in the government, but on the developers of such technologies. So in the end, you're just having faith on the people that possess the power to deal with those technologies in a way that is not harmful to the public. And that's this optimism, I think, would of course be missing in a maybe more believable vision about this topic, which would be that basically in the end, the general public has no say in how those technologies would be applied, how they would be developed, and how they would work against us. So in the end, like it ends up going towards this direction where, okay, so how can we protect ourselves as the public against those? Be it through, I don't know, like if there is some facial detecting stuff, how can we ensure our privacy as the public? If we can't trust on the government to not leak our data, how can we protect ourselves? But then again, it ends in what you said about this, I think you call it a power asymmetry, because those forces are always going to have more resources than us to either develop or implement those technologies. So is there any way we can go around that? Because I feel like that would be the case with any other technology as well. If you think about gunpowder or basically guns, you have examples of when groups try to bring that into the public and defend themselves against police force. And that was either judged as unethical by the people in power, or many were skeptic about how ethical, how that could be achieved, or how efficient it was at the end of the day. Does that bring us to the same place that we were before with guns, but now with AI? Are we having the same discussion over and over? Yeah, I think that's more like an open question I would like to put out there.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. So I think maybe the important thing to prioritize, and maybe like the type of like hope that's there, if that's what we're looking for, is that we need to be, how do I say, we need to develop not an analysis in the sense of like something that determines whether something is good or bad, but we need to have like a better literacy for these things is the main thing, especially like as a generation, like we need to be able to have better literacy for what these things actually are. In the short term, I think like everything's kind of fair game. Like, you know, the coalition uses like legal tools like public records requests to expose these things. You know, you can use all these systems to your advantage, like legal systems, technological systems. You can like find ways to play around with them and like take advantage of them to do good things. There's also like this, you know, this phrase that it's like, even if you're a prison abolitionist, like you still sometimes are going to have to bail somebody out of prison with like money by giving the prison money, right? So like the important thing I think is over time to like try to develop a sensibility that can actually apprehend what things are and what we actually care about, or like what we actually want from like power structures or like organizations, right? And kind of just and appreciating that the ways that we think about things now are very like limiting and very limited. Whether it's this, like as you point out, like whether it's like a legal determinism or technological determinism, like neither of those things is really gonna like fix the problem. Yeah.
I was wondering to what extent you're using in your work, or you're also aware of in other people's work, also the systems you've been talking about, feminist approaches to data, or also like gendered lenses, because I mean, especially in crime, we know that like some people feel more comfortable with security cameras, while for certain types of crime, security cameras don't do anything, and it might be more helpful to know exactly when the bus comes to not be raped instead of having a security camera. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if I don't want to keep speaking, but I think the one of the things that is centered in the work and the kind of organizing that's being done, especially that's like against police surveillance technology, is that it is like an abolitionist and like critical practice is also a feminist one, and it is one that also has like class in its like view as well. So I guess the thing that's that this kind of organization, like the way that I would respond, I guess, is by thinking about how this kind of like safety already exists at such a disequilibrium or like an asymmetry, whether it's between like genders or classes or things like this. And yeah, we need to be able to think about how things should be organized in order to not have those asymmetries. So I think if I kind of interpret your question, it's like I see like how, you know, surveillance can be something that's like also safe for some people. It can help as safety. It's a double-edged sword, right? Because it can also be used to criminalize at the same time. Basically, I think the answer to that is that basically surveillance isn't good or bad, but basically we have to take a step back to understand how is it being used, how is it situated in relation to different types of like policing practices, practices of enforcement, practices of violence. Because of course, you know, as it is now, the people that are behind those surveillance cameras are, you know, they're committing the same kind of crimes, basically. So, but maybe also like for different people. So I think, yeah, I hope that answers, yeah.
Hello. Okay. Thank you so much for the both of you. I think this is kind of maybe steering into a little bit of a different topic, but I'm curious in the, like, obviously we're in a room where I think interdisciplinarity is valued, and like maybe also taking like artistic methods of investigation seriously as a pursuit of truth somehow is like recognized as legitimate. But I'm curious in general in your fields to various like regards, how legitimate is maybe an artistic practice also in questioning these kind of computational systems, because I think like just coming from an artistic background myself, I think there is this relationship to data as truth being objective, art as emotional, thus subjective. And I think again, maybe this comes back to this question of like objectivity and subjectivity, but maybe we can also talk more about like the method of investigation. And I don't know if you would also call your practice artistic, but still I'd like to hear from both of you and maybe other people as well.
Yeah, Anna, do you want to take that?
Sure. I think it's a very interesting question, and I think, yeah, I guess it's a bit hard to answer it because, like, legitimacy for whom, right? Like, if we're trying to convince Palantir, or like if we're trying to address weapons manufacturers, like, I don't think our like how many PhDs we have necessarily matter in that conversation. Like, I think in terms of seeking to establish, like seeking to find new knowledge, or like knowledge, or like doing, like, let's say, rigorous research, let's call it like that. I think artistic practice is a very broad term, right? Like, there's so many different artistic practices that pursue their own versions of like knowledge and stuff. In my own practice, I kind of navigate that by thinking who is my target audience and what is the kind of new information that I'm presenting in my work that hasn't been known before. For me, that's a very important part of my practice. I try to always not just kind of repackage the already existing information through my artistic medium, let's say, but to try and use the mediums that I'm working with to discover something new that hasn't been known before. And that's something that comes from my own experience because as soon as you're not coming from, let's say, US or UK, it's very common to kind of take that information that is, I mean, once again, like very well known somewhere, and then just prepare it for like a different type of audience. So I'm always kind of coming back to where I'm coming from, and I'm thinking like, oh, is it actually something new for the context that I'm from? Like, is this something that is not known? Like, is it something that hasn't been discussed before? Is it actually useful for people who are affected by those things? So that's kind of, I think when we're like discussing legitimacy, this is kind of the questions, because I also feel like in artistic practice, you kind of have to develop your own criteria for legitimacy in a way, right? Because like our practices are so different. So that's kind of the questions that I determine the legitimacy of my work by, right? Like the kind of novelty of information and the relevance of it for the context. Like, do I do justice for the context that I am to represent? And then simultaneously, like, how does it address the audience that I'm engaging with by presenting my work in Europe? So that's kind of how I navigate this legitimacy. And I think with that, like, it doesn't necessarily matter as much like how deep you are or like how institutionalized you are in the spheres of expertise, let's say as a data scientist or as a, I don't know, forensic scientist, et cetera, I think if you think even about like how contemporary education works, unless you're trying to make a new claim in the field, unless you're trying to make a scientific discovery, you actually can become quite fluent in, I don't know, like coding language in a year, or you can learn how to make new neural networks within a very short time frame. So I feel with the contemporary education, those like levels of expertise are much more fluid to maintain this like interdisciplinarity, that not just like a tag word, but like genuine kind of interest in other practices. Yeah, that's kind of my thoughts around this as a, like from an artistic point of view.
Yeah, maybe we can have one more question before. If it's too short, if it's short, not too short, but we can have two maybe.
To that question. This is a question for both of you, and also obviously open to the public, but there's a conversation around, so in a previous question, someone mentioned the work you were doing, Anna, as like how you mix fiction and fact together, and how the claim is that certain aesthetics basically presuppose to an audience that something is fact or fiction. And I think there's a more important conversation that arises from that claim, which is that one, is there even a literacy around that generally, or is that like a class literacy, an age literacy? And there's this, you've mentioned in some of your previous work before, Peter, this idea of class aesthetics. I think that would be useful in tandem to that question and describing that and investigating that term further, because the work that you do involves a lot of literacy around game engines, what's mixed reality, what's real reality, what's archival, all these things. So maybe you could touch, both of you could touch on class aesthetics. That'd be useful.
Yeah, I think that's actually a fantastic question. I can't see Peter, so I hope you don't mind that I jump into that. Okay, cool. Yeah, I think it's actually a fantastic question, and I actually found some like absolutely crazy research around that, because when we think about target audiences of different type of aesthetic decisions, the type of aesthetic that I refer to as playing with that objectivity or trying to create that objectivity, it's an upper and middle class aesthetic. There is a lot of research. I mean, specifically, I'm referring to a body of research that has been done in the new wave of Russian propaganda that has been developed in the 90s. And it was very interesting because they developed a new kind of visual language that aimed to appeal to the objectivity of the state and the state apparatus. I mean, I'm referring to police here, that was able to maintain and like to skirt the public opinion to support the government at the time. It was basically at the core of the Putin's campaign in the late 90s. And I think that's very shared in contemporary environment. Once again, as Peter mentioned, the true crime stories. But then if you think about the birth of forensic science at large, contemporary forensic science is, first of all, a method of policing. It is part of the police departments. And forensic science was made by police in its contemporary form as a PR campaign to separate policing as we know it as a brute force that have been way too extensively criticized to actually have an authority, and that new aesthetic of objectivity that we see on the screen. And that's also what is known as CSI effect. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there was this TV series. I mean, we all know this, right? Like the kind of TV series around the detective who is on the journey to uncover truth, and then they use all this like cool gadgets to actually get that objective knowledge. So all this appeal of cool gadget is essentially a very class-coded thing, because the appeal of science and that authority of science aesthetically is something that is very class-coded. And that's also something that I found out in that research of the Russian propaganda in the 90s, that propaganda that was used only worked on the middle and upper classes. It didn't work on the people who, because of their underprivileged class background, because of their working class background, didn't have that deep rooted love for the scientific aesthetic. So there's a very interesting class divide in how those aesthetic choices influence us based on our class background. So yeah, I think it's like very fascinating to look into that, because I think it's kind of very interesting. Like with those, I mean, I think it's kind of coming across that like with those like aesthetic decisions, I'm never like kind of excluding myself from the equation. I'm always very curious about like how us, like as like, let's say like people in the room, like how do we react to different type of messages? Like how do we, like what kind of propaganda do we fall for? I think that's always like fascinates me.
Yeah, and with that kind of answers what is the importance of art too, right? Because even if we're dealing with investigating some kind of facts or traces of facts on the ground, it's like there's also these questions of how the facts appear to us. And that's something that we're able to like push and criticize and make people be more reflexive about when they're looking at the work. So yeah.
So I think we can continue our conversation at the bar. So I will just close the discussion. So we've reached the end of today's session. We would like to thank you all for coming, and also people watching from the stream, and especially today's guests. Thank you, Anna and Thank you, Peter. We'd also like to thank the team for making this possible, from streaming to setup to organization. So thank you all. And also we will continue with our loops formats. So like stay tuned. You can get updates from either our website, New Practice in Art and Technology, or our social media sites. So now I invite you all to continue the conversation at the bar.
And also thank you very much.